Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the Michigan Left with myself, Andrew George. We're going to do things a little bit differently this week. And the reason being is because I have an awesome interview lined up for you guys. We've talked previously on the show about Washtenaw County's newest prosecutor, Eli Savit, and the amazing progressive things he is doing in Washtenaw County. I have had the privilege of interviewing Eli earlier this week. And that was an extensive half-hour interview. And for this week's episode, I want to show you that interview. So without further ado, here is Eli Savit. All right. Thanks for joining me, Eli. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. I am fantastic. We've talked about you on the show quite a few times. I make jokes about it because every week you give me material. And I'm just happy to have you on the show to actually talk about some of these incredible progressive changes you're bringing to Washtenaw County. So I before this interview looked up, a few different things that you've been pulling off in Washtenaw County, and I wanted to ask you about them specifically and ask your opinion on why that's kind of the right move to take. Again, we're a pretty progressive talk show here, so I'm pretty happy with the results, but I want to hear your take on some of these issues. So the first thing I have on my list, Eli, is cash bail. And I think it's the first thing that you addressed as prosecuting attorney was a policy to end cash bail. Would you talk more on that?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So, I always think that it's really important to take a step back and talk about what cash bail really is. Cash bail is a system under which if you are accused of a crime before your trial, before you've been convicted of anything, you are sitting in jail until and unless you can come up with a certain amount of money to buy your way out. Now, what that does is two things. Number one, it means that if you are poor, if you are working class, even if you don't pose a danger to the community, you are going to be sitting in jail potentially for days or weeks or months simply because you didn't have enough money in your bank account to secure your freedom. At the same time, if you are a wealthy person, even if you are accused of a really serious crime, even if you pose a danger to the community, you may be able to go free simply because you are wealthy. So what cash bail does is it really imposes two systems of justice, one for the wealthy people and one for everybody else. And to my mind, that is simply unacceptable. So when we say we are not seeking cash bail, I want to be very clear about this. It doesn't mean that we're just opening the jailhouse doors and letting everybody go. I do believe that there are some people that pose a danger to the community and for the community's safety need to be held pending trial. But for example, if you are accused of a murder, if you're shooting at people, and we think there's enough evidence to bring charges, I don't want you back out in the community. But that standard should apply to everybody, whether you are poor or whether you are wealthy. And so what we've done is, at least from our office's perspective, we've taken money off the table. We will seek to hold people, regardless of whether they're poor or wealthy, if they are accused of really serious crimes and they pose an ongoing threat to the community. But we're not going to simply be holding people in jail before they've been convicted of anything because they don't have enough money in their bank account. And so what our policy says is, look, we are going to make an individualized assessment of every case, look at all the circumstances, and request the least restrictive conditions that ensure public safety. So in many cases, low-level crimes, you're in there for trespassing, you're in there for shoplifting, something like that. You don't pose a real serious danger to the community. And I don't want to just be holding you there because you are poor. In more serious cases, we might recommend release, but put conditions on it, right? Maybe drug or alcohol testing, right? In really serious cases that we think that we can still ensure the safety of the community, maybe a tether. And in the most serious of cases where there's no way to make sure that the community remains safe other than holding somebody pre-trial, we we will seek pretrial detention without bond. But the same standards need to apply to everybody, whether you're poor or whether you're wealthy. And I'll just mention this, there's a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, you probably shouldn't have done it if you didn't want to be held in jail pending trial because you were poor. The sort of pushback that you always get is if you can't do the crime or you can't do the time, don't do the crime. Well, a couple of points on that. Number one, this is all before your trial. This is all before you've been convicted of anything. Pretrial detention should not be used as punishment. It is not punishment. That's not the place that it has in our legal system. But the other and more fundamental point is that when we are holding people in jail simply because of how much money they have in their bank account, the cascading effects ripple outwards. If you are poor or working class and you are held in jail on cash bail for even a day or two, you are likely to lose your job. You lose your job, you're likely to lose your housing. You lose your housing, think about what that does to your family, to your kids if you've got them. They may be homeless. They may have to go live with relatives, right? They may have to switch schools in the middle of the year. And what we know from the data is that switching schools in the middle of the year in the best of circumstances is associated with approximately 6 months loss of academic growth. And all this is not because you posed a danger. All of this is because you didn't have a big enough bank account. And what the data actually shows us is that cash bail makes us less safe. Less safe. It is more likely, significantly more likely, that somebody commits a future crime if they were held in jail on cash bail than if they were released pre-trial. Now, why is that? That's because when you put somebody in an increasingly desperate situation, they are going to be more likely to commit crimes of desperation because you've taken away their livelihood. You've taken away their ability to provide for their family. The experience of New Jersey is really instructive. New Jersey got rid of cash bail in 2017. And what you saw afterwards was crime plummeted. And the types of crimes that went down were precisely these crimes of desperation. So, in my view, cash bail is just an inherently immoral and inequitable system. We should not be treating people differently in the criminal legal system based on how much money they have. But like everything we are doing, taking money off the table is also about keeping our community safe. And in the long run, it will.
Awesome. That is an incredible answer. Thank you so much for that. It was a great explanation for folks who don't quite understand the harms of cash bail. And you touched on so many great things. I mean, it's compounding. One, it's racially unjust. And in my opinion, it's legalized bribery. Because it's like you said, it's intended for poor folks because rich folks can just pay the funds and get out of jail. It's like get out of jail free card. So I think that's
and I'm glad you brought up the racial aspect of this too, because a cash bail is a system that perpetuates the long history of racism in our country in a very direct way. What cash bail does is it makes a wealth-based classification about whether you can go free pending trial. Throughout American history, what the government has done is made it extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for Black families to attain wealth. Of course, that started with slavery when quite literally the fruits of their labor, of Black people's labor, was stolen from them, was used to drive white wealth, rather than allowing them to create Black wealth. It continued, of course, through the de facto and de jure systems of Jim Crow segregation that we had after the Civil War, in which Black people were denied opportunities at good paying jobs, at fair educational opportunities, and the like. It continued throughout the 20th century when the federal government and many local governments engaged in racist redlining practices that made it difficult for Black families to purchase a home. The single biggest driver of generational wealth in the United States is home ownership. And for the vast majority of American history, we have made it nearly impossible for Black people to own a home. So this is, and so you fast forward to today when we still have this cash bail system, which makes an expressly wealth-based classification, right? It is based on how much wealth you have accumulated. And the truth of the matter is that perpetuates the legacy of systemic racism that we have had in the United States, because we've made it nearly impossible for Black people to attain generational wealth while allowing white people to do so. Then you have a wealth-based classification in the criminal legal system. It is no surprise that Black people are held pre-trial on cash bail at many times the rates of white people. And it exacerbates this cycle because, for the reasons I just mentioned, when you're held in cash bail, it further traps you in a cycle of poverty and makes it even more difficult for you to attain wealth. So there is a real and pronounced racial equity piece that directly correlates to what we have been doing as a country, which, even without that piece, I think cash bail is categorically wrong, because I don't think people should be treated differently because of their wealth. But we need to look this squarely in the eye and address the fact that this also perpetuates the searing legacy of racist practices in our country and really continues them through, what is not a race-specific classification, but because it is wealth-based, in practice really is.
Yes, it's inherently racist. Okay, so incredible. We have so much more to touch on, so we're gonna move right along. The next thing I want to touch on, and we're gonna kind of completely switch gears here, is the policy, recent policy change regarding psilocybin mushrooms and substances of that sort. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the new policy you will be implementing in Washtenaw County regarding that?
Yeah, sure. So what we've said is we are just not interested in prosecuting cases involving the use, possession, or cultivation of entheogenic plants. These are naturally occurring psychedelic substances, of which mushrooms are probably the most prominent one. There's a number of reasons for this. Number one, look. The data really shows us that these substances are not particularly dangerous. They're not associated with violent behavior. Many people use them for spiritual purposes, for purposes relating to mental health, and that's great. Some people, let's be honest, some people use them recreationally. Biggest city in my jurisdiction is Ann Arbor. I went to high school in Ann Arbor. I knew a number of people that were experimenting with entheogenic plants when they were younger, and they were doing so recreationally. The truth of the matter is, this isn't a priority for us. And one of the reasons for that is because the war on drugs has been such an abject failure. And the way in which it's been an abject failure is, first of all, you have to look at the racial inequities again. But at bottom, what it does is it imposes a really cruel roulette wheel in which many people are doing this stuff, right? They're using entheogenic plants, they're smoking marijuana, they're doing whatever. And they never get caught. They never get caught up in the justice system, right? An unlucky few do. They end up getting prosecuted and can really disrupt and ruin their lives. That doesn't make much sense at all. It's fundamentally unjust. And it's to root out something that really doesn't harm anybody. So what we said is that we are simply not going to prosecute these cases. Of course, I don't want people driving if they're tripping, and we want to encourage people to call first responders for help if they're dealing with a bad trip or something like that, right? And they need medical attention. But at the end of the day, we're not going to prosecute the mere use, possession, or small scale cultivation of these plants because it just doesn't do anything to keep our community safer. And in the long run, it perpetuates this arbitrary system in which only a select unlucky few end up facing criminal consequences for something that a lot of people in our community do. The other thing that I'll mention is, I probably would have done this policy anyway, but it was made really easy by the leadership that we saw as a result of activist pressure on the Ann Arbor City Council. In September, I think it was, the Ann Arbor City Council said that we are directing our law enforcement personnel that entheogenic plants are the lowest law enforcement priority in the city of Ann Arbor. They couldn't legalize it because it's a state law, but they said basically, if you're a police officer and you see somebody jaywalking and you see somebody cultivating mushrooms right across the street, which I don't think that's a factual circumstance that usually happens, you go after the jaywalker. It's the absolute lowest law enforcement priority. So functionally, entheogenic plants were decriminalized in Ann Arbor in all but name only in the fall, and it would be extraordinarily arbitrary for me to say that in the rest of the county I'm going to continue prosecuting these cases, where in Ann Arbor, this is already functionally legalized. The other thing I'll just mention is we look at data, we look at the experience of other places, and a number of cities have decriminalized magic mushrooms, decriminalized entheogenic plants. Denver did it, Washington, D.C. Recently did it, and there's been no adverse consequences whatsoever. So what are we doing imposing criminal consequences, potentially ruining somebody's life, when we know that this is really not something that in any way, shape, or form keeps the community safer? And that's sort of the gravamen of my prosecutor's office. If we're going to bring a case, you got to be able to answer the question, why are we doing this? And with entheogenic plants, there's no good reason for why we're doing it.
Unfortunately, not all prosecutors ask that question. And I'm very thankful that you do. It's a very progressive, it's a very modern stance to take. I think the rest of the world is going to start coming around to these types of policies. But as you know, Ann Arbor has been on the forefront of these types of policies for a long time. Ann Arbor was the first city, I believe, in the United States to decriminalize marijuana. So I think you're adding great progress to what Washtenaw County already had going on. We're going to move along again because we have quite a bit to talk about. And now we're going to move into consensual sex work. Now, I want to remind people before we jump into this that these are policies, right? So Ellie explained this earlier. State law is state law. So how these policies work is it makes certain crimes low-level crimes, and I'll let you explain that a little bit more, Ellie. But the next subject I want to touch on is consensual sex work. This is a little more controversial for people, but again, a very important issue. Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing in Washtenaw County regarding that?
Sure. So what we have said is we are not going to prosecute the mere act of exchanging sex for money or another thing of value. We are continuing to prosecute things like human trafficking. I really want to go after human trafficking, any sort of sexual abuse that occurs adjacent to a sex work transaction, physical abuse, and 100% we will go after anybody who seeks to purchase sex from a child, from a minor, right? Which we define as anybody under the age of 18. Those are really crimes that harm our community. Now, sex work in and of itself is not a priority for us. And in part, the reason that we did this and we were so public about it is precisely so that we can go after and know about these bad actors, these human traffickers, the people that are committing sexual assault, the people that are engaging minors or trying to engage minors for sex. But the truth of the matter is the best source of information on those fronts is sex workers themselves. Sex workers know if they're being trafficked. They know if other people that are sort of working adjacent to them are being trafficked. If there is a sexual assault that arises out of a planned exchange of sex for money, they are the victim. And we want to say very clearly, we want you to come to the police. We want you to report trafficking, to report sexual assault, to report physical assault, to report child exploitation. But if we say we're going to turn around and prosecute you as a result of that, we are not going to get that information that allows us to go after the real bad guys in this space and address the real harm in this space. So everything we're doing is geared towards effectively fighting human trafficking, effectively fighting sexual assault, effectively fighting child exploitation. But there's several other reasons that this makes sense. Number one, I'll just start with the basics. The truth of the matter is that the criminalization of the planned exchange of sex for money is really at odds with a lot of the values that we hold true in our constitutional system. In general, you've got a right to do what you want with your body. And certainly, sex is legal. It's only once money is exchanged that sex becomes illegal, but not even really then consistently, right? Because if you've got a camera going, then it's pornography, which is legal and protected by the First Amendment. You remove the camera, you turn the camera off, all of a sudden it's prostitution and it's illegal. That's a real tension that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I believe that people have the right and the choice to do what they want with their body. So that's a sort of baseline level setting for that. Number two, we know from centuries of experience that when we prohibit something, when we engage in prohibitionist policies, it does not, in fact, make us any safer, and it doesn't end the sort of demand for a good. What it does is it makes it a lot more dangerous. Look at alcohol prohibition. When we did alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, you saw demand for alcohol remain constant, but it became much more dangerous, and you saw violence and death associated with the alcohol trade. Prohibitionist policies move industries into the shadows, make the mere transaction illegal, which leads to violence, which leads to death, which leads to victims. Same thing with the war on drugs. What have we seen as a result of the criminalization of the war of drug use? We have not seen the demand for drugs go down. It remains constant. What we have seen is a lot of violence, a lot of death that is adjacent to the drug trade. We created cartels simply because we criminalized drug use, right? And the same is true with sex work. Prohibitionist policies around sex work make violence more likely. They make it much more likely for coercion to take place. And the victims of that are often the sex workers themselves. So it does not make sense as a general matter to be engaged in this prohibitionist policies. And we can look at other countries for examples. Over 100 countries across the globe have decriminalized sex work to one extent or another. And what we see out of those countries is you don't see the demand for sex work increasing or more people all of a sudden deciding they want to go into sex work. What you do see is safer working conditions, a decrease in violence and coercion and trafficking. And that's what we all should want. The third thing is this is a public health issue. When you make the transaction illegal, it reduces the leverage that a sex worker may have to insist on condom usage with a client because they've got no real way of enforcing the terms that they place on that transaction because they would be admitting to a crime. That is why, and you have to look at the data for everything, but I listen to doctors and I listen to science, and a series of papers in the Lancet, which is the world's leading independent medical journal, said that the single best thing that the world could do to stop the spread of HIV worldwide is to decriminalize sex work. That is the best public health thing that we can do. And this isn't a fringe publication. This is the world's leading independent medical journal, which is also why the United Nations, Amnesty International, the ACLU, and Human Rights Watch have all called for the worldwide decriminalization of sex work. The final thing that I'll just mention is a lot of people rightly say that the choice to engage in sex work is one that many people would prefer not to do, and certainly not to do in the long term. And I think we have to be real about that. Some folks, want to engage in sex work for only a limited time. And I don't want to stigmatize the choice to do that, but for many people, it is a stopgap to be able to support their family. They want to do it for a few months, maybe a year, and then move on to something else. When we have policies that criminalize sex work per se, it ends up trapping people in the sex work trade because when you have a criminal record, it makes it much more difficult to get another job, a job outside of the sex work industry. So these laws that are ironically geared towards preventing people from engaging in sex work actually have precisely the opposite effect. They end up trapping people in the sex work industry for far longer than they would like in a number of circumstances. In my policy, I quoted my former boss, Justice Ginsburg. She's associated with this quote that says, paternalistic laws are often meant to protect women, but they put them not on a pedestal, but in a cage. In the case of sex work, that is literally and figuratively true. If you say you want people to be able to leave the sex work industry, you should not be criminalizing it. What we are doing when we saddle people with a criminal record is we effectively trap them there. And, again, without stigmatizing the choice to engage in sex work, I don't want to do anything to force somebody to stay in that industry for a moment longer than they would like to. And so for all those reasons, that policy was in my view, the right thing to do. And, it's going to really bolster our efforts to get information from sex workers about the crimes that really matter, the traffickers, the predatory pimps, people that are engaged in abusive behavior towards minors. And of course, we'll know in a lot more cases about sexual assault or physical assaults that are adjacent to sex work.
So I'm happy you brought up the health aspect of that too. That's huge, hugely important. Like just with everything else, when you criminalize it, these workers are afraid to seek help for health. They're afraid to seek help for, if they're being trafficked, assault, anything like that. So I absolutely agree with you. I think it's an incredible decision to make. And again, very progressive. And I think the rest of the world will head that way eventually. I know Washtenaw County is not the first community even in the United States to pass such a policy. Las Vegas has had it for quite a while. All right, we're running out of time, so I do want to touch on one more thing, and then I also want to ask what you have in mind next. But I want to ask you about your recent policy change on juvenile justice. I guess that would be criminal or punitive versus restorative. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And so we're going to be building up a number of programs. I'm hoping in the coming months and years to address juvenile justice issues outside of the criminal legal system. But as a first step, we often sink our hooks into young people very early through the criminal legal system in a way that can really disrupt their lives. And often, the truth of the matter is, it's for low-level stuff, low-level adolescent misbehavior that they're just going to grow out of. I actually started my career as an 8th grade U.S. history teacher. I was a public school teacher. And, I love 13 and 14-year-olds. I really do. But sometimes they do stupid things. And, I'm not just saying my students did stupid things. I did stupid things when I was 13 and 14 years old. The fact that you make a mistake as an adolescent, the fact that you engage in some adolescent misbehavior should not mean that you are tethered to the justice system in a way that can really ruin your life. So what we said is we think that a lot of this stuff can be best dealt with outside of the criminal system. It can be dealt with in schools. It can be dealt with in the home. Sometimes, what a kid may need is resources, but a criminal response is ultimately counterproductive. So what we said is, look, low-level offenses, curfew violations, running away from home, instance where a kid probably may need some resources, right? Being a disorderly person, right? Tobacco and vaping offenses. Those aren't things that we're interested in charging in our office, nor are these sort of standard, typical things that kids and adolescents have been doing for generations, right? You get into a fight in the hallway in school. In most cases, that's not a matter for the criminal legal system. The school can impose appropriate discipline. The parent can impose appropriate discipline. You can address that without sinking the legal system's hooks into a kid. By the way, all of this, like everything that we do, is ultimately geared towards public safety. Because what the data shows, in fact, is that sending a kid to a juvenile detention center actually makes it significantly more likely that they'll commit a future crime than if you did nothing at all. And the reason for that is because of adolescent brain development. First of all, kids are less likely to be deterred by the threat of criminal consequences than adults because of their stage in brain development. But also, they are particularly susceptible to fear and to trauma, which can really impact future brain development. So when you take a punishment-oriented approach, and for these low-level offenses, you take a kid away from their family, away from their support system, away from their school, you put them in a juvenile detention center, it further traumatizes the kid, it impacts adolescent brain development, and makes it more likely that when they're out, they're going to commit future and more serious crimes. So again, we look at data, we look at research, we look at science, and we make decisions based on that. But I think that changes like this should be in place in prosecutors' office across the country, because not only is it in many ways cruel to a young person not to treat them like a young person, but at the end of the day, even if you don't care about that, which I do, it's just entirely counterproductive. So we're treating kids like kids in our prosecutor's office, and look for more partnerships. I'm hopeful in the future around better ways to address this outside of the legal system.
Fantastic. All right, last thing, and this one's probably the most difficult question. What's next, Eli? What's on your mind right now? What is the next thing you want to address in Washtenaw County?
Yeah. So we released a lot of policies that were, in my view, sort of low-hanging fruit. That the prosecutor has absolute discretion to do something, and so I can just write a policy, stroke a pen, change the way that we're doing things in our office. The sort of longer term goal is to work with the community, which we've been doing throughout, to build up systems outside of the criminal legal system that can address harm that is done. I can say I don't think this is appropriate for the criminal legal system all I want, and I have said that for a lot of things, but at the end of the day, you need a way to address certain types of harm that was done. So one thing that we're doing is we're going to be dramatically expanding our use of restorative justice in Washtenaw County, an alternative model to the traditional criminal legal system that is really survivor-centric and takes a more of an individualized approach to harm that was done. Again, it's been associated with lower rates of recidivism and higher rates of survivor satisfaction than the traditional adversarial justice system. And I want to be clear, we'll have more on this later, but we're not forcing this on anybody. It's about listening to survivors and taking stock of what they actually want to get. We will be releasing a policy, hopefully within the coming weeks, around the immigration consequences of our criminal legal system and making sure that we are not doing things which treat our non-citizen neighbors differently in terms of the net outcomes than what citizens would get. I really want to focus on the sort of probationary terms and the ways in which continued supervision can ultimately be counterproductive and make it more difficult for people to get jobs and provide for their family, and ultimately undermines public safety. So look for us to make some announcements on all those topics in the near future. And then I'm really interested in building out some new units in the prosecutor's office. We're working on a conviction integrity unit and an expungement unit, which will both go back and look at old cases. And if somebody was wrongfully convicted of a crime, we want to rectify that mistake. We also want to make it as easy as possible for people to expunge their old criminal records if they've stayed out of trouble for the statutorily prescribed time period, because that criminal record, for all the reasons we discussed, can make it difficult to get housing, to get jobs, to move on with their life. And ultimately, that makes us all less safe because it makes it more likely that future crime occurs. So, January rolled out a lot of policies. Again, I think it's a low-hanging fruit. Now we're really focused on building, and I'm hopeful to have some more announcements coming in the near future around all these issues.
Incredible. All right, Washtenaw County Prosecutor Eli Savit, recently elected. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. and explaining these progressive policies and putting them in terms where people can understand the purpose behind this. I already understood it myself, but I mean, it's incredible to hear it in these types of terms. So thanks again, Ellie, for joining. I hope to have you on the show soon.
I'd love that. Thank you for having me. And by the way, what I'll just say in terms of the explanation, if anybody is curious and wants to read more, we believe in transparency, and we put all of our policies on our website. So go to the Washtenaw County Prosecutor's website, read the policies. They say not just exactly what we're doing, but why we're doing it. I hope to be on your show again soon to talk about more. So thanks for having me, Andrew.
Absolutely. And we'll post a link to that URL on the description in this video. So
just Google Washtenaw Prosecutor's Office and then click policies. It's a complicated URL. So
got it.
But Google is your friend, and they'll get you there.
Yes. All right. Thanks again, Ellie.
All right. Take care.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Like I said, we've talked about Ellie in the past on this show a million times. I couldn't be more proud of what he's accomplished in Washtenaw County, and I can't wait to see what he has in store. In the meantime, go to patreon.com/MILeft if you would like to become a paying contributor to the show. Keep the show running. I love what we do here, and I just want to keep it going as long as possible. So again, that's patreon.com/MILeft. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll catch you next week with Mikal Goodman.